Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, patriots, skeptics, believers, doubters, and everyone still trying to make sense of what country we're currently living in at this very moment. Listen closely. My name isn't important today. What matters is the truth. And the truth is uncomfortable because on January 17th, 2026, in the streets of Minneapolis, something happened. Something happened that should rattle every single person who still claims to care about free speech, equal justice, or the rule of law, regardless of where you fall politically. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't a counter-protest. It wasn't democracy in action. It was a mob attack. And the fact that so many people are already excusing it, minimizing it, justifying it, or quietly celebrating it tells you exactly how broken our civic culture has become. Let's lay out the facts as clear as possible. Jake Lang is a controversial, polarizing, deliberately provocative political activist, and he arrived in downtown Minneapolis to participate in an event he had planned. Now let me stop right here and be clear, because honesty matters. I do not agree with everything Jake says or does, or much of Jake's rhetoric. To be honest, I don't know Jake personally. When the January 6th pardons happened, I did reach out to him on Twitter and talk to either him or a spokesman for him a few times, and I ended up with his or his representative's cell phone number, and I exchanged a few texts trying to get him on to do a podcast. That was around trying to get him on the podcast was around the time when that student had been stabbed, I think, at a track meet or whatever, and he was doing that rally for that, so he's getting some big mainstream publicity, and we never really worked out the details on hooking up for the podcast. Outside of those few interactions, that's all I really know the guy. I don't have really any personal ties to him or connection. It's just relevant to current events. Let's be honest, Lang has a history of inflammatory behavior and leans into confrontation. That's not in dispute. But here's the line that matters in a free country. Provocation is not a death sentence. Speech, even ugly speech, is not grounds for mob justice. It went from a rally to a manhunt in minutes. Lang and his group, by most accounts, was around 15 to 20 people, maybe less. They were immediately outnumbered hundreds to one by counter-protesters, counter-ICE protesters. This wasn't a spontaneous disagreement. It was an organized and emotionally charged environment, already primed for violence. Following the recent killing of Renee Good, the 37-year-old mother shot during an ICE-related confrontation days earlier, tensions were already boiling, and tensions were already even escalating in Minneapolis due to the whole Nick Shirley Smalley daycare fraud situation. There was also an event where a gentleman got hit, knocked down to the ground, claimed to be one of them. So they stopped attacking him. Then the sheriff's department swarmed him up in the van. So with tensions already boiling and videos already circulating online, what happened next? Lang got chased through the city streets. He was punched repeatedly. He was sprayed with unknown liquids. He was struck in the head, allegedly stabbed, but I believe the plate carrier stopped the knife from stabbing him, penetrating. If you do watch the videos on X or other places, there was a black or African-American gentleman who did help Jake out quite a bit. Then at an interesting turn of events, he got in a car with what appears to be more opposition, who let him off around the corner because when they realized who he was. There are reports indicating that the ballistic vest did prevent a fatal wound. Blood is visible running down his face as he sprints towards the vehicle that has the opposition. The mob follows. They attempt to drag him out of the car. They smash windows. They surround the car. And here's the detail that should terrify everyone. Police were not present during the most critical moments. Reports indicate officers had withdrawn, leaving a single individual, regardless of how hated, to fend for himself against a violent crowd. That's not law enforcement. That's abandonment. This is bigger than Jake Lang, so if you're listening right now thinking, good, he deserved it, then you need to pause. While I agree with you in sense that actions have consequences, and we grew up in a time where if you said something, you had to acknowledge the reality that you could be punched in the mouth for it. And I do feel like this world has gotten far away from that, which has led to a lot of problems. Hopefully one day maybe we can get back to that mentality of where we got to keep things that we say and keep in mind that it could have consequences, real consequences, but I'm not supporting violence in the overall sense. I'm just saying that actions have consequences, but at the same time, it's a tough line, right? In all reality, because true freedom of speech means you got to be able to say whatever you want, but you do have free speech, and he was able to exercise his free speech because he went and said things people didn't like. Then his freedom had consequences, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I don't necessarily agree with probably things he was saying either, or everything he was saying anyways. So just remember, let's just pause for a minute, because the moment isn't about whether Jake Lang is a likable guy or whether you agree with his politics or whether you like him or his views or things he was involved with. It's about whether mob violence is now acceptable when the target is politically inconvenient. History teaches us a brutal lesson. Once mobs decide who deserves protection and who doesn't, no one stays safe for long. Let's rewind. January 6, 2021. The day that became the ultimate moral reference point in modern American politics. Thousands of Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol. Congress was disrupted. Police were assaulted. Windows were broken. The seat of federal power was violated. Lang was there. He was accused of assaulting officers with a bat and also obstructing Congress. The response, over 1,500 federal charges, hundreds of convictions, sentences ranging from weeks to decades, media coverage labeling participants domestic terrorists, corporate blacklists, family estrangement, careers destroyed. Former President Donald Trump was impeached twice. Lang spent 4 years in pre-trial detention, what supporters often called the D.C. Gulag, before being pardoned in 2025, along with other January 6 defendants. And when those pardons, the outrage was immediate and ferocious. The narrative was fixed. These people were uniquely evil, an existential threat, the worst attack on democracy since the Civil War. Because this is where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. The summer of 2020 followed the death of George Floyd. What followed were over 7,700 protests nationwide. A lot of them were peaceful. Some of them definitely weren't. Cities like Minneapolis, Portland, Kenosha, and even Seattle saw buildings burned, police precincts overrun, federal courthouses attacked nightly, journalists assaulted, civilians beaten, entire neighborhoods destroyed. Estimates place the damage between $1 and $2 billion, the most expensive civil unrest in U.S. history. At least 19 deaths were directly linked to the violence. Yet the language used to describe it, mostly peaceful, understandable rage, necessary disruption. Charges were often dropped. Bail funds were promoted by major politicians, and they freed arrested rioters. Federal prosecutions were rare. The contrast with January 6 could not be sharper. One was framed as an existential threat to democracy, the other as a tragic but justified uprising. Then there's Antifa, a decentralized movement that somehow manages to both exist everywhere and be accountable nowhere. In 2020, Antifa-aligned groups engaged in months-long riots in Portland, attacked federal buildings, coordinated black bloc tactics. They publicly called for the abolition of police and borders. When conservatives raised concerns, they were mocked. When President Trump called Antifa a terrorist organization, the response from future President Biden was infamous. Antifa is an idea, apparently an idea that throws Molotov cocktails. After January 6, claims that Antifa infiltrated the Capitol were investigated and dismissed. Fine, facts matter, but where was that same investigative zeal when Antifa-aligned violence dominated American cities for months? Why weren't those riots treated as a domestic terrorism? Why weren't there mass federal indictments? Why no congressional hearings? So let's fast forward to today or yesterday. In Jake's case, ICE protests swell, Renee Good's death. Federal agents continue to clash with demonstrators. Tear gas deployed, objects thrown. They're pouring water on the roads to cause ice to try to stop the vehicles. Officers are attacked. A protester shot in the leg. Civil liberty groups sued the government. And then Jake Lang shows up. Suddenly, violence against one man becomes acceptable. Suddenly, the police disappear. Suddenly, silence from the same voices that once said violence is never the answer. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We no longer have a shared standard for political violence. If violence is committed for the correct cause, it is contextualized. If it's committed for the wrong cause, it's criminalized beyond redemption. This is how nations fracture, not because people disagree, but because laws stop being neutral. When mobs learn they can assault opponents without consequence, democracy doesn't advance. It absolutely collapses. This is a warning. You don't have to like Jake Lang. You don't have to defend his speech. You don't have to attend his rallies. But the moment you excuse a mob beating someone in the street because you hate their views, you've crossed that line that separates civilization from chaos. Equal justice is not optional. Free speech is not conditional. And safety is not a privilege reserved for the popular. America does not survive hypocrisy. And if we keep pretending this double standard isn't real, then Minneapolis won't be an exception. It'll be a preview. This is Nick Lewis, and this is Arms and Arguments.